Welcome to The Plant Report, a radio show that educates about the green world one plant at a time. The Plant Report is a new educational resource about plants, herbal medicine, ethnobotany, and the human-plant relationship. With over 400,000 species found worldwide, plants give us oxygen, food, fiber, and medicine, and add beauty and inspiration to our lives. Listen to our podcast, read our blog, watch our videos, and learn from experts and the plants. The Plant Report is a project of Sustainable World Radio and is hosted by Jill Cloutier. Thanks for listening to The Plant Report because every plant has a story. My guest today is Andrew Moore, author of the book Paw Paw: In Search of America's Forgotten Fruit. Andrew Moore is a writer, gardener, and paw paw enthusiast. Welcome to the program, Andrew.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Today we're going to be spending the whole time talking about pawpaws. And can you start out by telling our listeners what is a pawpaw?
Yeah, I'd love to. The pawpaw is the largest edible fruit native to the United States. So if you're going out looking in the American woods, it's going to be the biggest fruit that's out there. And for the most part, especially in recent years, it's unheard of. Most people don't know about this fruit, so it's a forgotten fruit. And it's really perplexing to me as to why it's forgotten, because it's a really great fruit. It has these tropical flavors and texture. Actually, it's kind of like a custard apple, and it tastes like a cross between a mango and a banana. So it's a really good fruit, and it's been neglected and forgotten for the most part for quite a while.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, it's part of a really, in my view, illustrious family of plants. There's ylang-ylang and cherimoya and guanabana, which are really delicious, yummy tropical fruits. So it's really interesting to me that we have this plant, this tree growing throughout the U.S., and people don't know it. And it does taste very tropical. Yeah.
It is a wonderful family to which it belongs. Those fruits are among some of the best tasting fruits to be found in the tropics. And so it is pretty exciting when you think about, for me, I live in Southwest Pennsylvania, and I'm preparing for winter, and it's, it could be a cold one, and yet next summer I could enjoy this fruit that, by all accounts, is kind of a tropical fruit, and I can grow it in my backyard. So yeah, it's a neat thing to have.
It is, and one of my friends from the podcast sent me a pawpaw last year, and I have to tell people it is one of the, I think as I ate it, I thought this is one of the best fruits I have ever tried. It is so good.
Really?
Yes.
Okay, that's great.
Oh my
that's
gosh.
High praise, yeah.
Yeah, and when it arrived, it looked very almost rotten in a way. It was really black or dark brown, and I thought, oh no, it didn't make it. Oh no. And then he reassured me. I contacted him. He said, no, it's perfect. Eat it. And I'm so glad I listened to him. It was really good. Kind of like cherimoya a bit.
That's one of the things that's I find fun about pawpaw is as it ripens, the flavor changes so dramatically, and people kind of prefer it at different stages of ripeness. So it's a fun fruit to have in that regard. And then, as you mentioned, it may have looked a little rotten and bruised. And often the fruit can just kind of brown or blacken the skin, which doesn't always indicate the degree of ripeness. It could just be bruised. It's a very sensitive fruit, so the outer skin could be bruised, but when you cut it open, you may find like a vibrant yellow pulp that's, by all accounts, perfect.
So you love the flavor of pawpaws, and you wrote an over 265-page book about this fruit, this tree. Why are you so enamored with the pawpaw, and how did this particular fruit capture your interest and imagination?
Yeah, so obviously something was set off in my mind, right, to make me want to do that. I was introduced to the fruit about 5 years ago at a festival in Ohio. And I had never heard of it before. Aside from the one friend who invited me to attend this festival, none of my friends, none of my family knew about it. So when I got there, I really wasn't sure what to expect. and didn't think much of it. And right outside the festival grounds was a patch of wild pawpaws, and I went in there, and it was just exciting. There was fruit in the trees on the ground, and I could gather it. And we talked already about its tropical properties. It was this large tropical-looking fruit that was growing wild in Ohio, and something in my imagination, something in my brain, just thought this was such a neat thing, and the mystery of it too. Why hadn't I heard of it? And what I wanted to know, where did it come from, and why hadn't I heard of it? And so, it wasn't just a good tasting fruit. It was a fruit that led me to ask all kinds of questions. I found that everything I learned, and as I answered those questions, I just thought it was a wonderful story. And so that's what led me to do what I did.
Can you tell our listeners, so this is the largest edible fruit in the U.S. Can you tell us a bit about its history? And I think it's been on the planet, I think I read in your book, 56 million years. Is that right?
Yeah, it's hard to know exactly how long, but it dates to that period in time, at least, or up to 56 million years ago. It's an ancient plant. It's one of the oldest in the United States. And yeah, it's been around. The proto-Asimina is what I call it in the book. What the plant that would become the pawpaw we know today has been around for. It survived a couple ice ages.
Wow.
And it would move with the retreat of the glaciers, and then as the climate warmed and cooled, it moved around. And so what we think happened is the pawpaw evolved near Mexico, United States area, perhaps near the Gulf, and as the climate warmed, it moved into kind of more of the ranges where it is today. All of which to say is that it is a plant with these very ancient tropical roots that evolved to be where it is now. And it's the only plant in that family. We talked about its relatives, the Cherimoya and so on. And that family is called the Annanaceae family. And it is the only member of that family that's not found in the tropics. So from a plant perspective, it's really unique.
And many of the people that you spoke to, which I found really interesting in the book, was a lot of people that you bring up Pawpaws, that they would get almost nostalgic and like, oh, I haven't had one since I was a kid. Oh, I remember going out and picking these. And do you think the story of the Pawpaws being forgotten is also kind of the parallel story of people not being in nature and not going out and harvesting wild food? And what was it like to talk to so many people who had forgotten this fruit?
No, I think you've hit it exactly. That's exactly what I think. It parallels, So I call it America's forgotten fruit, and forgotten implies that we once knew it, and it's true. Americans in the eastern United States knew it well, and we knew it well enough to write a song, Way Down Yonder in the Paw Paw Patch,
which I used to sing all the time when I was little.
And had no idea what this pawpaw was,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's the case with a lot of people. And so when you do find people who remember growing up and eating it, it transports them back to that different time and that different era. When you're right, we would go into nature for leisure, but we would also go into nature to pick the blackberries, and we'd pick the hickory nuts off the ground, or we'd go hunting, or we'd pick pawpaws. And if you look, with the rise of a food system and diets really that were, became much more processed and industrial, we stopped eating locally. We stopped eating things that were grown in our communities. And pawpaw is one of those things that got left behind. There are many things that we've lost over the past century, and pawpaw is one of those things. So when people hear about it, they remember it, and and it's fond memories. It's a memory often of a family too. Especially some of these older folks who went out as kids picking pawpaws. They went out with their grandparents or their sister or brother or a parent, and they had good times going and picking pawpaws. It was fun for them.
And so during the course of writing the book, you traveled the Paw Paw Belt, which I didn't even know existed. Can you tell us where you traveled and what is the Paw Paw's native range in the States?
Yeah, so the Paw Paw Belt, that's kind of a term I came up with, or, Paw Paw country, if you will, however you want to term it. It's basically where pawpaws grow wild, and that includes 26 eastern states, so a lot of country. And it's from the Atlantic Ocean well past the Mississippi River into eastern Nebraska, eastern Iowa, and from the Gulf Coast, from southern Louisiana and the Florida Panhandle, north into southern Michigan. So a really large swath of land and some diverse climates as well.
Wow. And so it sounds like the pawpaw is very hardy. And so I'm curious, why do you think that the pawpaw it's never been brought to large scale domestic cultivation?
Yeah, so here's my thought on it is, we talked earlier about people knowing the fruit. It was once better known, and it wasn't something that we had to cultivate to know. It wasn't something that we had to plant to eat. It was something that grew wild and grew abundantly. And if you wanted it, all you had to do was wait till the season came. And if you knew where the Paw Paw Patches were, you could go and gather them. And so, like many wild foods, it was something you could count on nature to produce. And what happened was, we got away from it, as we've sort of already talked about. We stopped doing those activities. We stopped going to the woods to gather these things. And if no one was doing that, there was no way to get it because we hadn't planted it in orchards. We hadn't made that transition into a commodity or a crop for agriculture. And so now we're in the predicament where people are learning about this fruit again, and there's no easy way to get it. People have sort of lost that folk knowledge of where those Paw Paw patches are. We often live quite isolated from nature, and if you live in a city or a suburban community, sometimes it's hard to get out to those places, and certainly if you don't know where they are. So it's going to take some time to regain that folk knowledge. But in the meantime, people are starting now to grow pawpaws and add a few trees to their farms, and so you're starting to see them at farmers markets and some local food co-ops even. And so maybe there's going to be a better chance of people having access to this fruit now.
And I read in your book, too, about blueberries and how they're another wild, late domesticated crop. Do you think that the pawpaw could follow in the blueberries' footsteps? I guess, I don't know if footsteps is the right word.
Sure, yeah. I give human traits to fruit and food all the time. Yeah, footsteps. It could. It very well could. I think, I offer that example in the book to show just because something hasn't been domesticated or just because something isn't currently part of our food system doesn't mean that it can't happen. We're an industrious species, Homo sapiens, but we haven't done everything yet. So just because the pawpaw hasn't, become a commercial crop doesn't mean that it can't be done. People often look for an answer as to why hasn't it happened? What's the roadblock? And I really don't know that there is a solid roadblock for it to occur. If people want pawpaws, people can get them. It's not something that can't be done. And so, yeah, blueberries, it was just 100 years ago that the blueberry was domesticated and became a crop. Before that, you had to go in the woods and pick it. No one was farming this thing. Whereas today, you think about blueberries, and it's absolutely something you can get at the grocery store, something that can be grown in the southern hemisphere and shipped to the northern hemisphere. So, which is quite different than the way it was 100 years ago.
Yeah, year-round availability I don't like that in fruit. When I like waiting for the time when the strawberries come and waiting, because then it's more special.
Right, and so the other end of the spectrum is, perhaps the pawpaw doesn't become a crop like that's available year-round and can be shipped around the country. In fact, it's probably, if the pawpaw does transition to a domesticated crop, it's probably not going to look similar to most fruits that we think of today because it is so delicate, because it is so fragile. It's not going to ship around the world very well. So more than likely it's a fruit that's going to have to be grown and distributed and marketed locally. So that's one thing that I actually really like about the pawpaw is that it's this fruit that doesn't yet belong to big agri-farming. It belongs to the small farmer and the local markets and the local systems. And so far it seems like that's going to be the way it's going to work for the pawpaw is finding producers and consumers in a more local, kind of tighter knit community.
For those who want to grow pawpaws, what are the needs of the plant? I read in your book, don't ever, for germination, don't let the seeds dry out. What about from that? Tell us why that's important, and then just a bit about how to grow them.
Sure, yeah. So, some people say the pawpaw is really difficult to grow, and others say it's really easy. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle there. So there are a few things you just need to know about pawpaw, and if you follow that, you can be pretty successful. So if you're growing it from seed, you can't let the seed dry out or the seed dies. So the pawpaw seed needs to be stratified. It sits in a moist medium, and you can keep it in your refrigerator over winter and then plant it in spring. And you can also buy pawpaw trees. There are nurseries around the country that are selling trees, even grafted types. So whether you grow a pawpaw from seed or you buy a tree, then you need to find a right spot for your pawpaw tree, whether it be in your garden or in your farm. And at a young age, the young seedlings are actually very sensitive to sunlight. So you want to shield the young seedlings from too much sunlight in their young years, and that can be just a simple shade structure. As they get older, they can actually take full sun, so they're not confined to the understory, which is their natural habitat. So once you get them in full sun, they actually will often produce more fruit in full sun, but they can also do fine in shade as well.
Do you know how hardy they are temperature-wise?
So the common statement is that they're hardy to -20. But I've been talking to folks lately who, I talked to someone today in Vermont who says that he knows of some mature trees that are hardy to -30 in Vermont. And I've seen it in northern Illinois, trees that are hardy to -30 there. Wow. So incredibly hardy for this tree that is somewhat tropical, if you will. And the limiting factor, I think, for the north is getting fruit to ripen before a freeze. So, the further north you go, the later your season is. And if you get a freeze and your fruit hasn't ripened yet as a late ripening fruit anyway, that's going to be the biggest roadblock for northern production.
And what about, does the pawpaw need a lot of water?
Yeah, the pawpaw does need water. It's native to the humid and wet eastern United States. It's not going to like drought, but it also wants well-drained soil. So you wouldn't want to put it in a swampy location. But in the east, once you get your tree established, though, it's not something that you have to. Especially if you're a gardener or a backyard grower, you're not necessarily going to need to irrigate it. It's a native plant, so once it's established, it's going to be fine. But when you start thinking about like a commercial setting, irrigation can be pretty important, especially if you're dealing with a drought.
And some of the other interesting things I learned about pawpaws from your book were that its deer and livestock are reluctant to browse. And
yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yes,
and
that's
another
rare.
Another reason to like this funny little plant. So I just people talk about it being deer resistant, and that's of course for a lot of folks something that is very attractive about it. And I say that with a caveat that I've seen deer eat pawpaw, and deer will eat just about anything once. They don't like the way it tastes, so they won't be coming back to it. But it can and does occasionally happen. But for the most part, deer and a lot of other livestock, they don't like to eat pawpaw because we believe it's because these chemical compounds, these ananaceous acetogenins that are found in the twigs and the leaves, that's very off-putting to them. So there's actually a permaculture farmer in Ohio who integrates goats and pawpaws together. And so his goats are grazing underneath his pawpaw trees. And it's beneficial for both.
So these acetogenins, I think you pronounced it. Tell us a bit about that, because that was really interesting how pawpaw has been used medicinally, and it really shows a strong promise for anti-cancer treatments.
Yeah, going back hundreds of years, folks had ground the seeds up and used them to treat head lice, actually. What we now know as acetogenins was identified, hundreds of years ago just through folk medicine practices as being potent enough to kill head lice.
Which is
and
tough,
then,
yeah.
Well, yeah, exactly. And a very valuable chemical. And we talked about those tropical plants that it's related to. And in India and parts of Southeast Asia, some of those other plants that are related to pawpaw that grow there, the same medical practices have been documented there. So folks around the world have seen the value in doing this.
Oh, it's so interesting. Yeah, and they were in the book. Researchers are studying how the pawpaw actually will, how did you describe it? It will go and affect the mitochondria of the cancer cells. So it holds a lot of promise. And I know there's a lot of people that have heard of guanabana being used for anti-tumor, anti-cancer. And I think the pawpaw is even more potent. So that's really promising.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think it was after the Purdue scientist, Jerry McLaughlin, identified the Ananaceous acetogenins, scientists in other part of the world started looking at its relatives, so guanabana. People were looking at that. And in fact, after these compounds were identified, I believe folks started referring to guanabana as Brazilian pawpaw to associate it with those chemical properties that are found in the pawpaw plant. And we should mention though that these chemicals they're found mostly in the tree's bark, twigs, leaves, and in some cases in the fruit, but less so as it ripens. So it's not something that you would necessarily get just by consuming the fruit. It's more of an extract from the plant.
And I like that it's from the twigs, it sounds like mostly, and you don't have to kill the tree to harvest for the extract.
That's right. Yeah, you would just prune your tree back, and not you or I, but the companies developing these herbal supplements, they could trim the trees back and develop this product it's currently on the market. There have been clinical trials that have shown that it's stopped symptoms of cancer, and in some cases, it appears to have stopped the cancer entirely.
It's incredible. And one thing too, for people to be aware of, because we're so yes, natural things are so healing and wonderful, but you also have to be careful sometimes because some plants have very strong compounds, very effective, strong compounds. So in the book, you talk about you don't want to swallow the pawpaw seeds. Can you tell us why? What happens?
Right. So those acetogenins, they're not necessarily found in high amounts in the ripe fruit, but they're high concentrations of it in the seed, and they're big seeds, so it's not something you necessarily have to worry about accidentally consuming. But if you do, you will get sick. You can vomit. It's emetic. So it's a very negative experience, and I've actually had it happen to me a couple of times when I was pulping and blending a pawpaw smoothie, and there was a small, not fully formed seed that I didn't get out, and I drank it, and so I can testify that it's not a pleasant experience, but I survived.
Yeah. You're here. You live to tell the tale.
Yeah.
And then the dried fruit. I know that in the book you were saying how in the past people would dry the fruit, but then that also can make some people not feel great.
Yeah, this is another of the mysteries of the pawpaw. Multiple sources have reported eating pawpaw fruit leather or dried pawpaw and then feeling sick or getting nauseous or having the same outcome as eating the seed. And we don't really know why you could consume fresh pawpaw, but once you dry it, it would make you sick.
Unless the
more than likely.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, exactly. If you were going to say the concentration of these elements, that's absolutely what we think is happening. Which again, though, bringing it back to the mysteries of the pawpaw and really lost foodways is there are several citations of Native Americans eating dried pawpaw. We know that they preserved it, so they were doing something to it to make it palatable, to make it edible.
Interesting.
So whether it was the addition of lye or ash or some other technique, but something they were doing enabled them to be successful, and we just don't have that right now. We don't know what made that possible. Native Americans made great use of much, if not all, things that were useful. Certainly, there were things that they didn't tap into, but they just made such great use of everything that was native to this continent, and pawpaw was one of them. Certain tribes and groups actually used the tree's inner bark as a fiber, and so they made netting and rope out of the inner bark of the tree. And then certainly they ate the fruit. They would have eaten it fresh, and in some cases they may have dried it to preserve the harvest. And some tribes, we know the Shawnee in the upper Ohio River Valley, they actually celebrated a Paw Paw moon. So we know that it was important enough and celebrated enough to kind of name a season after the fruit. So we know that it was an important fruit.
Well, the pawpaw plant, really, that fruit is so enticing. So I could see how people are drawn to it. They eat it. It's medicinal. And I can see how it traveled. I think plants are so smart because they entice us with their fruit or their flowers, and then we do the work for them and move them all around the world.
Yeah, it's wonderful to think about as well. The pawpaw has been described as an anachronistic fruit, similar to like the Osage orange. The fruit likely developed to be eaten by the large megafauna that's now extinct, and they would eat it whole and then transport the seeds around the continent. And then when those animals disappeared, that work was left up largely to human beings. And so you have to wonder, the fruit didn't really evolve necessarily to be eaten by humans, yet we are so attracted to it, and it is so delicious. And so, it happens that it works really well, that we want to eat this plant and cultivate it.
Mm-hmm. And then another interesting thing about the pawpaw is the flower it's not going to be like the ylang-ylang flower, this floral, heady, wonderful smell. And what I think you described it in the book as a fermentation floral scent. So who or what pollinates this flower with that type of scent?
Right, with that type of scent, it's not what we traditionally think of often of a attractive flower. So it's pollinated by actually carrion flies and beetles. It's pollinated by the insects that actually are attracted to decomposing flesh and rotting meat. That's carrion flies. That's what's attracted to the pawpaw flower. And flower scientists believe that it's that odor that attracts these insects, and also its color. So it's got what I consider to be beautiful maroon flowers, and that color is thought to mimic the color of flesh. And so, the pawpaw is not alone in that. You think of trillium in the eastern United States, the spring flower that also has a similar scent and a similar odor to attract similar pollinators.
And the corpse flower, that huge giant flower, I wonder if that is a similar thing. Have you seen those big?
Yes, absolutely. It's they all smell. They have those similar those odors. Now the corpse flower is absolutely more foul smelling than a pawpaw flower, and it's incredibly large and certainly foul smelling. The pawpaw is a little more subtle than that, so it's not like you have to worry about stinking up your backyard if you choose to plant it. It's more on the lines of a sourdough bread or a nice warm fermented odor.
Beer, and you can make pawpaw beer, right?
You can, and people are, and doing quite a bit of it. Every year I hear of a new brewery doing it. Folks in Ohio have been doing it for a while, and there's at least a dozen breweries in that state that do it. But I've drank and enjoyed pawpaw beer in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. I've heard of folks doing it in Missouri, and so it's an art that's spreading, and people seem to be really enjoying it.
In your travels across the U.S., you met many pawpaw aficionados. Can you share with our listeners just one or two stories of these pawpaw lovers, I should call them?
Yeah, there are many of us. We're not a huge tribe, but we're a growing group, and we're definitely passionate. People who are drawn into pawpaws. It's definitely a peculiar type of person. And much of that has to do with the fact that it's this kind of a treasure hunt. When you learn about pawpaws, it's an exciting adventure. Whether or not you're just looking to harvest fruit from the wild, it's fun because early on you don't know where to find these things, so you have to hunt them out. And then on the other end of the spectrum is skilled horticulturalists, farmers, people who want to have an impact, and they see a fruit that has so far received little attention. And they think, if I start working with this thing, we could have a huge impact, and we can introduce to Americans something else that they can, whether it's just eating each year or if it's a farmer, it's something that could earn you a living, perhaps. So people are excited by that and drawn to that. So, one of the most important people in the modern Paw Paw story is a man named Neil Peterson, and he was introduced and learned about Pawpaws in the mid '70s, and then has devoted the rest of his life to really bringing Pawpaws to the people. Trying to domesticate the fruit, and he conducted these really ambitious breeding experiments, and he gathered the best Pawpaws in the country and set them out in orchards and analyzed fruit and looked to find the best Pawpaws that would, kind of be a basis for an agricultural crop, and has since released cultivars to the public. And they're exceptional Pawpaws. He did some really wonderful work, and we modern Pawpaw lovers are the better for it to have that material.
Mm-hmm. And it must have been so exciting for you traveling around, walking. I think you had to cross rivers, and you were out. I love the story about being holding your shoes because you forgot your boots as you're crossing the river.
Yeah. Lots of adventures. It was such a fun book to write, and doing the traveling for it and going to these unique places that I might otherwise not have a reason to go to. Was a real joy.
And do you have any memories of walking through the woods, or you're out in the wild? Were there any Paw Paw patches that really spoke to you, that you were just like, oh my gosh, this is amazing that I'm seeing this?
Yeah, so often, and it's funny, when you spend this much time eating and researching and thinking about one fruit, you feel like you're going to hit a threshold, and you're gonna get tired of it, and sometimes that did happen, but every time I was hiking through the woods and looking for a Paw Paw patch, that same excitement, that childlike excitement would come over me when I'd find a tree, and I'd be like, oh, there it is. It was like, it would just return to me instantly. And if I had gotten a little cynical, or if I'd gotten a little tired of it, it was gone. And so every Paw Paw patch I stumbled into was a lot of fun. And one story, so there's this, in Paw Paw circles, there's the lore of Lewis and Clark. At the end of Lewis and Clark's journey, they were paddling down the Missouri, and they ran out of food. They had nothing left to eat. But thankfully, it was Paw Paw season, so they could go onto the riverbanks and harvest Paw Paws. And so for 3 days, Lewis and Clark's expedition ate nothing but Paw Paws, which is just a wonderful story. And especially for someone who's interested in this fruit, it's just such a neat footnote in history that Paw Paws were on that iconic voyage. And so I wanted to go. They kept meticulous journals, so it was easy to kind of figure out where they were when that was occurring. So I went to Missouri, and I went to the banks of that river. I found Paw Paws there, and they were growing in abundance. And so I had to wonder, certainly these were offspring or similar to the fruit that Lewis and Clark were eating. So when I found fruit there and I ate it, I was transported there, and it was a really neat connection to eat this fruit and to think about not just Lewis and Clark who ate it, but the native peoples who were there long before them, and they were eating this same fruit.
It's living history.
Absolutely.
Is there anything else you want to share with our listeners today about Paw Paws?
Well, I could go on, and so I won't. And what I'll just say is, Paw Paw season is in the eastern United States. It's roughly mid to late August through early October, so depending on where you are. So if you live in the eastern United States, start looking and doing research and talking to folks about where the Paw Paw patches are, or start asking, at your local farmer's market to see who's growing Paw Paws. And if you don't live in the eastern United States, start asking, or look up some nurseries and find a Paw Paw tree to plant. And winter is a great time to strategize, and by next season, perhaps you can have a Paw Paw adventure planned out, and you can either get some fruit or plant a tree or something like that.
And how long does it take for the tree to produce fruit? It's quite a while, I believe.
Sure. So if you're growing from seed, it does take 6 to 8 years. But you can buy, if you buy a grafted tree, it's going to be considerably less time. And if you buy, a seedling tree that's been grown out, maybe 3 to 6 years, something less.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, sure, it does take time. And this entire time I've been on this Paw Paw journey, I've been growing them from seed, and I've actually got a pair of trees in my backyard that have flower buds forming.
Wow.
And so next year, if all the pollination goes correctly, I'll have my first backyard-grown Pawpaws, and that'll be a exciting moment, to say the least, for me.
Oh, that's great. And one quick question I had, too, is are the Pawpaws, are they long-lived trees? Were any of the trees that you saw, I wonder how old they were, the largest ones?
Some of the largest trees, and you know, in right conditions, they can get up to 30, 35 feet. Some of those trees, you would think that, you know, they could be 30, 40, 50 years old, perhaps older, but more than likely the tall trees won't be as old. But what you can have is a patch that can be, you know, hundreds of years old, because the pawpaw does spread through clonal root suckering and root shoots. So when you encounter a patch, you know, you're thinking about genes and a particular organism that could have been there for you know, hundreds of years, if you know, certainly less, but potentially as much as that length of time.
You may have mentioned this earlier. Are Pawpaws growing in popularity internationally? Is anyone growing them outside of the U.S.?
Yeah, in fact, they are quite considerably growing in popularity outside the United States. Throughout Europe, Eastern and Western Europe, people are growing Pawpaws on a small scale. Reports from Asia indicate that in Korea, you know, there's some experimental orchards with like 1 million Pawpaws growing. Pawpaws are being planted and grown in Japan, and in Japan there's even a small farmer who makes a Pawpaw gelato. So in some cases, you know, the Pawpaw is really taking off internationally.
Yeah, and you actually have a recipe for Pawpaw ice cream in your book, which sounds really good.
Yeah, it's my favorite thing to do with a Pawpaw, besides eat it, is to make ice cream. I think it's the key Pawpaw recipe to have.
It's great. And so if people want to learn more about Pawpaws and read about your adventures, where can they find you and the book online?
The best place to go is chelseagreen.com/pawpaw. That's my publisher's website, and from there you can you know, view the book, read a sample chapter, and find links to my own blog and my Twitter and my other online presence. That's chelseagreen.com/pawpaw.
And in your book, in the very beginning, you had a quote from a garden magazine in the 1920s, and it said, "It is said that no habit gets a stronger hold on a man than the pawpaw habit." Do you think that's true, Andrew?
It feels true. It definitely feels true to my case. So I'd say so.
Yeah, and I would say so. Listeners, watch out when you plant your pawpaw. That could be the beginning of a lifelong love affair with this plant, because it does sound amazing and it is so delicious. Thank you so much, Andrew. It's been wonderful to talk with you today and learn about this forgotten fruit.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me, and I hope you can get some more Pawpaws next year.
Me too. Thank you so much. To learn more about the green world, visit theplantreport.com. The Plant Report is produced by Jill Cloutier and is a project of Sustainable World Radio. For more podcasts about plants, permaculture, and ecology, visit our website, sustainableworldradio.com. The Plant Report is created for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any health condition. Thanks for listening to The Plant Report, and don't forget to thank the plants for everything they do.